Hi, and welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of everything happening in Raleigh in public policy and politics. We're covering all of North Carolina from right here at Carolina Journal. I'm Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal. Joining us this week with expert insight and analysis, Alex Baltziger. He's our political reporter covering the General Assembly for Carolina Journal. Make sure you go to carolinajournal.com and see his articles there. Of course, from the John Locke Foundation, Mitch Kokai is here to share all he knows about some of the big lawsuits that are coming up this week. Also joining us on the couches this week, I'm really glad to have them here, Carolina Journal's summer interns. You've probably seen lots of what they've been writing this summer. We're really proud of everything that they've been doing. We have Kevin Garcia. He's a student at Davidson, done some fantastic work. He's going to be talking about his new series out this week on carolinajournal.com. And Grant Leffler, who is a student at UNC Chapel Hill. He's been doing lots of good coverage, including a lot of the entertainment pieces that we sometimes don't get to here at Carolina Journal. We'll be talking about all of that this week, but first let's start off with Mitch. We've been anticipating this, I know we all have for a long time, lawsuits from COVID vaccinations. Bring us up to date.
Yeah, there have been a number of suits related to COVID, and one of the interesting things is that 3 years after the height of all of the concern about COVID, still we see a number of these COVID-related suits working through the state court system. There's a big suit involving the shutdown of the Ace Speedway and whether Mandy Cohen at the time, who was now the head of the CDC, but at the time was the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, did she overstep her authority when she decided to shut down that racetrack in Alamance County? There's also a suit that's out there about the shutdown of private bars across North Carolina, and whether Governor Cooper and his shutdown of bars was something that was unwarranted because he allowed other businesses that serve alcohol to remain open or to reopen more quickly. There's also a suit about whether the flagship campuses of the UNC system, Carolina and NC State, should have to refund some of their student fees for the semester when they kept students off campus, but still charge the fees for these on-campus services like computer labs and other things that this lawsuit says, hey, we shouldn't have to pay for them. Right. But the one that's of interest that had some developments in this past week was one that is dealing with the forced vaccination of a 14-year-old. This is a story out of Guilford County where a 14-year-old who was playing for a high school football team got an email from the Guilford County schools saying there's been a cluster of COVID cases. To continue on your football team, you need to go get a COVID test to make sure you don't have COVID. His stepdad drove him to the school. It was a different high school where he had to go to this testing site. Walks in by himself. The stepdad stays in the car, and he sits down to get his test. At the same time that a testing is taking place, there's a vaccination clinic. And as he's sitting there, the people who run the vaccination clinic are trying to contact his mom, can't reach him. They don't contact the stepdad who's sitting outside in a car or a truck, but instead, when the student says, no, I'm just here to get a test, and they can't reach anyone to get consent, someone involved in this clinic said, oh, give him the vaccine anyway. And they did. He gets the vaccine. So the mother sues and says, look, I'm suing both the school system and the Old North State Medical Society that conducted the clinic, saying like they violated my constitutional right to guide what's happening with my son. They violated his right for bodily autonomy. That case is working its way through the court system. And whatever happens with it, it just reminds us that 3 years later, we're still dealing with all kinds of legal issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Absolutely. That is really alarming, that idea that a child would be vaccinated without parental consent. Do you think we're going to be seeing more of this, particularly if she's successful?
Well, I don't know if they're going to be able to have any new suits related to this because you would have a statute of limitations. But if something happens that's similar to this, if we see more surges of COVID-19, I think you certainly could see another round of lawsuits.
Sure. Have lawmakers begun to start addressing this, or it feels a little bit like it's getting swept under the rug? It's all in the past. Let's not look back. But do you feel like lawmakers have some concerns about these things?
Absolutely, they do. And I can't remember exactly what they've been doing, but I remember, I think in last year's budget, they had something in there. And then this year's budget, they also have something grappling with COVID vaccines and these sorts of mandates. But yeah, lawmakers are concerned about it, but I think you're right. It has become something of almost the distant past, even though it's something that happened not very long ago. So it has not been a top level political issue anymore.
there have been a few employees that maybe had to leave their jobs in state government for not getting that. So we may see some of those cropping up as well.
Yeah, now, and one thing to mention, you asked about the lawmakers. One thing that did happen fairly early on was that lawmakers passed some legislation that would shield different agencies for problems related to COVID. Like there was another suit against UNC about the shutdown that took place during the actual spring 2020 semester. But there is some legislation that was passed at the time that shielded the university from any legal liability. So that suit has had a tougher road.
Right.
But the suit about what happened in the fall of 2020, when almost every campus was open except for the two flagship campuses, and they were still charging for computer labs and meal plans and all kinds of stuff that you couldn't use because you were stuck by the demand of the university at your home. That lawsuit, I think, might have a little bit more of a possibility of being successful for the students.
Grant, were you on campus or not on campus during that time? Or were
So
you a
I
freshman?
I was a freshman during that time, and I was on campus technically for 3 weeks. That was so I moved into an off-campus dorm at that time, and I was there for 3 weeks, and then we all got COVID, so they all kicked us out. And I just didn't go back all through the rest of the year. However, my roommates and a lot of my friends, they did go back to stay in the dorms just because they wanted to have like somewhat of a social life, which I totally understand. However,
You're a college student, of course.
Yeah, but I decided to stay home, and have a job and just do all my online classes. I know, right? Yeah, good for me. Good for me. But yeah, that's what I did. But it's a different story for other students. So I'm really interested in seeing, just really what happens here. Because potentially I might be getting some money back. So
well, who knows? Well, that's the question. When you were a freshman, did you have access to computer labs and facilities on campus that you were being charged for?
I'm not sure exactly like how it worked. It was on campus. I know for sure I just didn't go to them just because I was just holed up in my dorm room just with my laptop, just doing all my online classes there. And so that was the case for me, but it might have been different for other students. But
And
I'm
that's
not
a mental
totally
health.
sure.
There's a mental health component to this too. It's isolating, certainly. How did Davidson handle that? They're in a different situation being a private school.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think more so than even just being a private school, the fact that it's such a small school and such almost like a rural area. The funding that they had for COVID tests definitely helped. The isolation from big population centers definitely helped to the point where there really isn't an argument there to be made about trying to get money back just because basically everything was open. There were pretty draconian sort of mask rules that sort of disrupted the social life.
But
like
you had
different
access
events.
to the facilities.
Yeah, but they were still there. So aside from that, everything was available. And so there really isn't an argument to be made about getting any money back because those are, obviously you did lose certain intangibles like social life and such.
Of course.
But those aren't really things that the college itself puts money towards.
Right,
so,
right. Very interesting. Okay, good. We're going to shift a little bit over to Alex, what you've been talking about. Give us an update on what's going on at the General Assembly.
So not a lot still.
Okay.
They're still in budget negotiations.
It's like a painful silence.
Yes, yes. But next week they're going to be holding votes on Wednesday. That's been announced, I think, by Speaker Moore. And we don't know. There are 6 override votes that are on the calendar to be voted on at some point. We don't know if that'll happen Wednesday or not. I think the majority party is going to have to look at the numbers and see if they have the necessary votes to override. But if we see any override votes, I would expect we'll see all 6 override votes happen. But yeah, that is
what are some of the
to
ones
be decided.
we're following for these overrides?
So there's 2 transgender bills on the calendar. One is dealing with women's sports. So basically you have to play
fairness in sports.
Yeah, fairness in women's sports. You have to be of the biology, the gender that you were born with to play in a sport, except there's now an exception where women can play in men's sports. Because there are certain scenarios where that might make sense.
On football teams and things like that.
Right, and then the other one bans like child mutilation. So you cannot have one of these gender transition surgeries if you are a minor, and then it also deals with stuff like puberty blockers and certain things like that. And then there's a number of other bills. There's a couple dealing with charter schools, and then you remember the others, Mitch?
And then there's the Building Code Council issue,
Sure.
which I think is probably the one that's attracted the least amount of attention. And then the Parents' Bill of Rights.
Yeah, Parents'
Oh,
Bill of
wow.
Rights. That's the big one.
This is a big policy sweep if they're able to override all of these for Republicans.
That's right. And Parents' Bill of Rights is something that's been pushed back a little bit further on the calendar.
Okay.
I'm not sure why they were waiting to deal with it, but that one is a big policy issue because there's a lot of parents concerned about what rights they have over their children who are in the public education system versus what they don't have and what can be disclosed to the parents and what can be hidden from the parents and stuff like that. So
Right.
that is a major piece of legislation, but I would expect it to be overridden at some point.
Very interesting. Okay, we've also had a lot more candidates jumping in the races, particularly Dan Bishop. That's a huge announcement.
Dan Bishop is a
Right.
huge get for Republicans.
Okay.
In fact, the Republican Attorneys General Association has already announced that they're endorsing Bishop.
Wow.
Which I'd be curious to see how many times they go ahead and jump into a primary this
Sure.
early. But it seems like they may have been involved in the recruitment process a little bit. But Bishop is a huge get for Republicans because if you guys remember, Republicans have not won that seat in a very long time.
That's true, right, because we have Stein and Cooper.
That's right. So even as Republicans are winning a bunch of other statewide races and council of state races, Republicans have for some reason not been able to secure that attorney general spot. And so Bishop is a really strong candidate because he has a proven track record of raising money,
Okay.
number one.
Sure.
And he's already got a decent amount of name ID too.
Right.
And then he's also got a lot of other outside money behind him, including from the Republican Attorneys General Association.
Okay.
And then the big one that also announced pretty much minutes after he announced that he was running was Club for Growth.
Right.
And they are probably the foremost conservative outside spending organization. It spends the most money of any type of independent expenditure in
party?
the country. Yep, of either party.
Okay.
So they've sort of elevated themselves recently, and they helped Senator Ted Budd win
Right.
his race both in the primary and the general election. So that's a pretty huge get, and both of those organizations are highly committed to getting Bishop elected.
Sure, sure. He does have a primary candidate, though.
Yes, so he
Or
still has a
competitor.
primary. There's one other Republican who's announced. His name is Tom Murray.
Right.
He's a Republican from Wake County.
Okay.
He is an attorney. He's a pharmacist. He's a former lawmaker.
Veteran, I
So,
think, yeah.
yeah, he's a former veteran.
E.A.
Or
Morris
he is a
fellow.
veteran.
E.A. Morris fellow, that's true.
That's right. So Tom is a strong candidate.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I don't know that he's going to have the outside support that Bishop has, and
Okay.
so I wouldn't see this being a super
Very
close race.
interesting.
But we'll see what happens.
All right, we're going to be watching that really closely. Do you think, I'm already seeing the Democrats lining up against Bishop over HB2. What do you think do you think that that'll be something he has to overcome in that kind of race? Is he
It could be
originally filed
be
that?
something in a general election, but I'm not sure that by the time that this race comes forward that it's going to be that much
Okay.
of an issue. Had it happened within a year or two of the whole furor
Sure.
about HB2, might be a bigger deal. Now that our state is sort of back where we were, I'm not sure the people
Right.
had that as top of mind. This is going to be very interesting though because it is an open race.
Right.
This is not challenging an incumbent. This is an open seat, and it's probably the first really good chance Republicans have to win this race in a long time. Josh Stein won two very close races to
Right.
win the Attorney General's job. So it's something that Republicans could win with a good candidate and a lot of money behind that person. And it could mean a major difference because the Attorney General is the person who kind of oversees law enforcement
Sure.
issues from the state perspective, including looking into corruption in government,
Right.
which is one of the things from the time when the George W. Bush Justice Department was investigating lots of corruption among public officials. Basically, all of that was happening at the federal level.
Sure.
Roy Cooper, Attorney General at the time, was doing hardly anything on
Right.
corruption, and basically the feds would say behind the scenes that Cooper and his people had to be dragged kicking and screaming to help.
Right.
If you actually had a Republican in that office and was interested in looking at rooting out corruption in government, I think that state Justice Department could be in for some major changes.
Sure, and Dan Bishop, he's really made a name for himself being willing to go out on the pointy end when it comes to things like that.
Right, even against members of his own party.
Sure.
He was, I mean, as of fairly new congressman, he was willing to be one of just a handful of people to stand up and oppose Kevin McCarthy as Speaker.
Right.
That really surprised me, honestly, because most Republicans kind of fall in line and get behind the guy who's going to win the race.
Very interesting.
But Bishop stood up and was able to work out a deal to get some of the things that he wanted there.
Right.
So.
Right. So what's gotten your attention? You want to start with Grant? Do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I would say definitely on the one thing that has really piqued my interest is Bud endorsing Robinson for the governor's race.
Yes, that came out this week.
Which is definitely not a surprise because Robinson endorsed Bud for his Senate candidacy back in 2022. And that left Mark Walker, who is also running for governor now and who ran for the Senate back in 2022 against Bud for the primary in the GOP. It left him pretty upset, given the fact that Mark Walker played a very instrumental role in advancing Mark Walker from being just a pretty normal guy into the lieutenant governor, and who is a guy at the moment has a good shot at being the next governor of the state of North Carolina.
Favored, yes.
So that's definitely something that really piqued my interest going on. So a lot of the personal politics are going on here in the state.
Sure. Kevin, what are you watching this week?
Well, with the topics just covered, I found it really interesting, just sort of the history of how the Republican Party hasn't been able to capture the Attorney General position. I think me and Alex had a conversation early in the week about just how long it's been since the Republican Party have been able to capture that seat. So especially with Mitch's comments, I definitely think it's really important position, and it's really going to change the tide.
Sure, and Stein and Cooper. Yeah, Stein and Cooper have been running, almost in opposition to the General Assembly as they tried to defend some of the laws that they've passed, some of the policies. So we'll be watching that really closely. Actually, I'm going to come back to you, Kevin. You have a great series out this week on CarolinaJournal.com about North Carolina's growing Hispanic voter base. Tell me a little bit about what you learned. You had some great conversations, and we can find them all at CarolinaJournal.com if you want to read the series. We had one published yesterday, one publishing Thursday, and one Friday as well. Kevin, fill us in a little bit on what you learned.
Well, this sort of just follows the trends that we're seeing nationwide with Hispanic population growth. I believe it's been a couple of years now that Hispanics have overtaken African Americans as the largest minority in the United States. Here in North Carolina, it's a little bit different. We are one of the fastest growing Hispanic populations compared to the South. We also stand out a lot because the Hispanic population here actually has the lowest median age of 25, which actually means a lot of Hispanics right now are most likely still in high school and college, which makes them a lot younger and probably going to have a lot to play in sort of the politics that they vote for. Around like 53% of them are eligible to vote, which means that a lot of them are going to be up for grabs, especially in the coming years. Not just for the next election, as I said, because a lot of them are still in high school. That sort of eligible voting population is just going to keep on growing. So the interesting thing I found with the conversations I had was that there seems to be a lot of disagreement on how much the Republican Party should or should not be willing to change its policies to appeal to them. There's sort of one group of Republicans that are interested in reaching out to them, mostly just by tailoring the message to be in Spanish, but still encompassing the same values and policies, including the topic with that sort of stereotypically attached to be very important with Hispanics, which is immigration. And there seems to be another group of Republicans that, still think that Hispanics are hold a lot of traditionally Hispanic values, mostly because of their heritage, religiosity, but that sort of think that it'd be a lot more advantageous to sort of switch a couple of policies to better sort of attach with how the views of Hispanics on maybe being like softer on immigration, sort of being more willing to offer amnesty, easing the immigration system to allow like more farm workers to come here, and just other policies like that. But
sure.
That's what I found.
How are they trending? So one of the analyses that you did was to talk a little bit about they do vote primarily Democrat, but is that changing?
So I would say from my analysis, it's definitely true that they are trending nationwide. There seems to be a little bit of misalignment with the issues that they pull for supporting, which tend to be left issues. But a lot of them tend, if you actually look at the voting, they tend now to vote a little bit more Republican.
Interesting.
A lot of that, from what I've talked to, is probably not actually coming from better outreach from Republicans, but is most likely coming from lack of engagement from Democrats. I wasn't able to get a hold of any of the Democratic Party's people on the subject, including like their Hispanic caucus. I heard from a couple people that it's most likely because they're just not active. Which is really interesting because the Republican Hispanic caucus wasn't actually active for a really long time, since actually the McCain years. And they've only just recently started back up. And they seem to be having a lot more success. But again, that's only started. And sort of looking at the voting trends, a lot of what I'm seeing is Democrats are becoming a little bit too comfortable with Hispanics willing to vote for them in sort of large margins. But those margins keep getting smaller every election. And a lot of that may just be because the sort of younger Hispanics who tend to be born in the U.S. And sort of encompass those American values, most likely are breaking away from their parents who maybe came as immigrants and sort of developed a relationship with the Democratic Party because they were so much more pro-immigration.
Interesting. And so it's whether or not Republicans can capture that.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Grant, what are your thoughts? I know you all have been talking a little bit as he's been working on this.
Oh yeah. It's like the one thing that really kind of piques my interest on this subject is like what's kind of driving the shift from, because Hispanic voters in America are more likely to vote for Democrats. However, there's that trend where they are starting to vote more for Republicans, and the margins are getting a little bit smaller. What is driving that is my question. As you said, that Hispanics, they're for the most part are very Catholic. They have very kind of Catholic traditional values, and so they might be more aligned with the social conservatism of part of the GOP. However, I also add that as the Democratic Party, at least like Bernie and AOC are becoming more left-wing and more outspoken, then they're kind of aligning themselves kind of informally with kind of the Latin socialist governments of Latin America. So Venezuela, Cuba, and kind of giving them, I wouldn't say this like totally endorsing them, but giving them some like footsies here and there and occasionally. And of course, during the Obama's presidency, there was also that opening up to Cuba, the Cuban thaw, as they called it. And of course, when Trump was elected president, he closed that down. And many Cubans, especially in Florida, were not very happy with that because they see Cuba for what it is, which is a communist dictatorship. And they're also plenty of Hispanics, I imagine, are seeing what's going on in Venezuela. A lot of migrants are coming from Venezuela across the border and immigrating here to the United States because of the economic crisis that's going on there. And there's also economic crisis going on in Argentina, which Argentina has historically been like the most stable country in all of Latin America, and also concerns over crime and violence in Ecuador. They're having a presidential campaign at the moment. Actually, yesterday, one of their presidential candidates was assassinated, actually. And so there's a bunch of concerns regarding what's going on in Latin America and how is the Democratic Party responding to that. And so my question is, how could that lack of response potentially be driving Hispanic voters more towards the Republican Party here in the U.S.?
Sure. Mitch, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing that I found from Kevin's first article was that it was a positive sign that Republicans are at least thinking about these issues. Years ago, basically, you'd look at the two major parties and Spanish language voters, and the Democrats would target them as they target every other group. Here's what we're going to do for women. Here's what we're going to do for blacks. Here's what we're going to do for gays. Here's what we're going to do for Hispanics. And Republicans would say, here are our ideas. Everyone should come to them because they're good for everyone. The idea of having a particular style of outreach for this group or that group wasn't really on the radar in a lot of places. And you heard at the time people who were advocates for Republicans who are native Spanish speakers saying, look, you got to do something. I mean, tell us something. Translate things into Spanish. Tell us why your ideas are good for our families. And Republicans were not very good at that. The fact that they are trying something, whether they're trying something that works really well or something that doesn't work really well, at least they realize it's something that they need to do, because this is a huge untapped pool of potential voters, of folks who, because of their own internal ideological beliefs, would align more closely with Republicans if Republicans could figure out the way to get the message to them.
Right, and they're young. I mean, they will be around. The median age, he was saying, is 25 in North Carolina for Hispanic voters. That is a tremendous win for whichever party can and that's the other difficult thing. We talked about this also. You can't lump anybody into a voting block necessarily based on something like race, because you have a variety of incomes, you have different kinds of industry. It's hard to rely and characterize one group of people as being that way of voting. So selling the ideas rather than some of the philosophies might be a way to go. What do you?
One of the more interesting things for those out there who are not boxing fans, if you think that all Latinos and Hispanics are the same, watch a boxing match. And if you ever have a Mexican against a Puerto Rican, they're about to kill each other. Or Dominican against a Mexican, or against a Puerto Rican against a Cuban. There are so many different groups, and they are not all one group that thinks exactly alike.
Right, and it's these vibrant communities are popping up all over North Carolina. It's something that everybody should be paying attention to. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Definitely not a monolith. Like, everyone's got, like, Cubans are more conservative, very broadly speaking, even on economic issues. I think broadly speaking, Hispanics are more middle of the road economically.
Okay.
They're definitely not communists or socialists, but they probably wouldn't lean into totally free market ideas all the time either. And so I think that is a hurdle for conservatives. But then on the social issues, I do think they're much more in line with Republicans generally. And so then you got to take other issues like immigration and think about where we're at there. Right. So it is interesting, but we'll see what happens. I remember back in the Bush years, this compassionate conservatism, part of that strategy was targeting Hispanics, so softening up on immigration. Okay. I remember Karl Rove talking about this.
I do, yeah.
And the idea was to go more middle of the line on immigration in order to not necessarily directly outreach and talk to them about these particular issues, but to have that as part of the ideas that they were putting out.
Sure.
And part of that was because Bush and his team were in Texas. I mean, they had to deal with Spanish-speaking voters, because that was a huge chunk of the electorate there. That is not something that folks in other parts of the country necessarily have had as much experience with as the Bush folks.
Sure. Anything you want to add to wrap it up?
Yeah, definitely. I think just from everything you said, specifically talking about looking back at the issues in Latin America and sort of the diversity of Latinos, specifically here in North Carolina. Right. There's not a lot of really good polling sort of dividing, let's say, Mexicans, Cubans, Venezuelans. So you really have to look at sort of other proxy factors to really see how these groups really differ in voting. And when you actually look at that, there is a lot of diversity. Specifically with Mexicans, they seem to be the most left-leaning group out of Hispanics. If you actually look at sort of like the dual citizen presidential vote for the president of Mexico, Mexican Americans overwhelmingly support AMLO, which is a very left-leaning president. So the sort of idea that Mexicans are who are dual citizens, able to vote in both countries, are gonna vote for AMLO, then vote for Trump here in America, it's kind of a stretch. But if you go look at Cuba and Venezuela, Cuban and Venezuelan voters, in places where they're in high numbers, like in Florida, they tend to go overwhelmingly Republican. Right. Especially like even younger voters and middle-aged voters. So that's definitely a group where they definitely are more conservative, and it's not just sort of like this one election time, it's happening repeatedly. Right. So you really have to tackle these two different groups differently, have different strategies to be able to talk to them. Very interesting. Make sure that you see Kevin's articles. He's got a series out this week on CarolinaJournal.com. All right, Grant, I'm going to move over to you. This is one I've been waiting for. I like this one a lot. I know when y'all head back to school, a little binge watching might be on the agenda between classes. Plenty. So give us a sense of what TV shows out there really speak to North Carolina.
Well, so Bet Carolina, there's their website that's based here in the Tar Heel State, and they recently compiled a list of the 10 best TV shows set in North Carolina. And so using that, they number one is, of course, the Andy Griffith Show. That's not a surprise really to anybody. Andy Griffith, of course, hails from Mount Airy, in the fictional town of Mayberry, which is really just based on Mount Airy. That was probably, in American culture, probably the most direct example of kind of North Carolina in American popular culture. Everybody knows the Andy Griffith Show. Everybody has seen it, at least for the most part, in my opinion, except for Kevin here. I don't think he's ever seen it.
You've never seen it?
I've never seen it.
Really?
Coming in number 2, we have At Home with Amy Sedaris. This is a new show. Amy Sedaris, she hails from Raleigh, and she was Raleigh raised, and so this show is kind of based off kind of the 70s kind of arts and crafts and cooking kind of domestic life shows.
It's a little weird.
It's very surreal, given that Amy Sedaris, that's her humor is, and of course her brother is David Sedaris, and he has a lot of kind of humor too. Number 3 is Eastbound Down. That's a HBO show. It's set in Shelby, North Carolina, with Danny McBride. This was kind of his first breakout show back in 2009 when it first aired. It's not appropriate for families, I will say, but I do personally like it a lot. So if you're an adult, I highly recommend that show. The next show is The Carmichael Show. It's starring Gerard Carmichael. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's an African-American comedian. He hails from Charlotte. He's had a lot of success in the last few years. He's kind of one of the big breakout stars that came out the last 10 years on the comedy scene. And that show really focused on kind of African-American family relations, but also is set in Charlotte, which is his hometown. After that is 2 similar shows that coming in number 5 and 6. My Brother and Me, which was a Nickelodeon show back in the 90s that aired for 1 season. That also deals with African-American families in Charlotte. And also Delilah, which I believe I'm pronouncing correctly, was a legal drama on the Oprah Winfrey Network that aired for 1 season, but is held, I believe, got some pretty good reviews when it came out. I haven't seen it personally myself. After that, we have American Horror Story Roanoke, and so that's based off of the Roanoke colony, the lost colony of Roanoke story. And American Horror Story, that's just like an anthology series on FX that kind of follows. It's every season's a new horror story that's going on. I haven't seen it. It's personally not my cup of tea, but it's held in fairly high regard. After that, we have number 8, One Big Happy Family. That was a TLC show. It was a reality show that aired, I believe, in 2010. Set in the Charlotte suburbs, only aired for, I think, 2 seasons. After that, we have number 9, we have Outer Banks.
Yes.
And so Outer Banks is the Netflix show. I personally can't really get into Outer Banks myself.
Really?
So the only time I could get into it was when Armando Bacot, who of course plays for UNC, he made like a 1-second cameo on it and said like one line, and everybody at UNC was freaking out about that. So that was really the only time I really watched Outer Banks. But then number 10, last and certainly not least in my opinion, is the king of the teen dramas, the WB CW teen dramas, One Tree Hill, that was filmed very famously in Wilmington. And so yeah, those are the top 10 shows.
That's exciting. I like the only thing about Outer Banks was that so much of it was filmed in South Carolina. Right? You remember that whole? It was all down Sullivan's Island in Charleston. You could take a ferry from the beach to Chapel Hill, or whatever it was. That really threw me for a loop a little bit.
There's still an ongoing joke in Chapel Hill regarding the ferry up to Chapel Hill during the magical, North Carolina River that apparently exists that nobody knows about. So yeah, that's what's going on.
Very interesting. The film community, film grants, film community. This has been an ongoing thing. Everybody loves to see North Carolina in movies and TV, but we still have a little bit of an incentive grant, but not as much, right?
We do. It's not as open-ended as it used to be. There used to be a program where if you filled out the paperwork and explained that you had X amount of expenses, you were going to get a percentage of that back. And it didn't matter how big the production was. That was then changed into a grant program and really scaled things back. Plus there was a set dollar amount rather than just, well, if you qualify, you're going to get this money, and they really didn't know how much they'd have to spend. The incentives are going to be a long-term issue, and the funny story that we have at the John Locke Foundation, one of our former research directors who was dead set against incentives, didn't like them, but yet when Colin Firth came and shot a movie a block away from the old John Locke Foundation office, this guy and his wife were stalking him and trying to find him, and they caught him and got a picture with him. So, this is the type of thing where even if you think Target incentives are bad. People like movies and films and seeing stars, and we liked when Claire Danes was shooting Homeland 2 blocks away from the old office at the State Court of Appeals. People just get into this stuff. The one other thing I'll mention is I only knew about half of these shows, which being an old guy, I wasn't surprised. But I was glad Andy Griffith was still #1 because it is such a great show for its message, for the family and how you treat other people, and the comic relief of Don Knotts
My favorite.
as Barney, and nip it in the bud, and all the great sayings that have come out of that show.
Absolutely. Are we hearing any discussion about film incentives down at the General Assembly? Or it always seems to be surfacing here and there?
I haven't heard a lot of conversations about it. I mean, I know there's a number of movie enthusiasts down there, so I think they'd be glad to get some sort of more incentives going, and I know we lose competitions to Georgia, for example, a lot on stuff like that. So I think there probably is some motivation there.
Yeah, I mean, the market's here. We've got everything that they can need. And all right, so Kevin, your last assignment as intern. Watch the Andy Griffith Show. All right, great.
And Blue Velvet.
And Blue
It was filmed in Wilmington, and it's my favorite, one of my favorite movies,
Excellent.
so I'll recommend it to you.
Perfect. All right, thanks for joining us here on the Debrief. Make sure you like and subscribe. We'll be bringing it to you every week. Have a great weekend.